Fentanyl, heroin, meth, and other lethal drugs are pouring across our wide-open border, stealing hundreds of thousands of beautiful American lives, and it's happening like never before in our history.
At 4:58 a.m. in Seattle, Washington, a covert federal raid exposed what officials later called the largest security breach in the state system, uncovering a 2.2-ton narcotics shipment tied to a transport company executive who had been under secret surveillance for months. The investigation centered on the city's nonstop seaport, where constant movement of fishing boats, cargo vessels, and container cranes provided perfect camouflage. Among the warehouses linking the Pacific Northwest to Asia stood Emerald Coast Logistics LLC, owned by Abdul Rahman Yusuf Hassan, a 46-year-old Somali executive known for meticulous operations, rigid scheduling, and an unblemished record with no scandals, arrests, or failed audits. He employed more than 880 workers, many Somali immigrants recruited through family and community ties, projecting an image of stability, loyalty, and reliability. Behind that orderly exterior, however, federal analysts identified troubling irregularities. Cargo ships tied to Mexico's narcotics corridors, docking simultaneously, containers repeatedly moving through the same terminal between 1 and 3:00 a.m., and reports from local residents of screams heard from sealed rooms within restricted facilities, signals that ultimately led investigators to uncover a secret no one had expected. Immigration investigators eventually traced both missing Somali children and major drug shipments to the same address. But the decisive warning came when federal cyber units breached encrypted systems and uncovered plans to move 2.2 tons of narcotics into the United States under the cover of legitimate commerce. The data revealed long-term cooperation with the Gulf cartel, not for months but for years, leading federal command to a single conclusion. This was not a shipping company, but criminal infrastructure. At 4:12 a.m., the order was issued to sweep the entire port. Inside the complex, armed contractors posing as security personnel took up positions, prepared to use lethal force to protect the network's leadership. And as the operation unfolded, truths buried for years behind locked rooms and flawless paperwork began to surface. Investigators soon realized they were not dealing with isolated financial irregularities, but a fully developed maritime pipeline. Analysts from the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security mapped Emerald Coast Logistics container traffic at the Port of Seattle and found a precise, repeatable pattern: containers departing western Mexico, arriving in the same time window, at the same dock, handled by the same crews, with no deviations. Behind the operation stood cartel boss Jose Alfredo Cardenas Martinez, overseeing a system simple in structure, yet devastating in impact. Federal estimates later confirmed that over a 26-month period, Emerald Coast Logistics transported at least 5 tons of cocaine and methamphetamine concealed within maritime containers, hidden in false bulkheads, industrial packaging, and palletized cargo labeled as construction materials and household goods. Every shipment cleared inspection using paperwork that appeared flawless, approved by a small circle of bribed port employees, including customs officers and inspection coordinators, who ensured the containers were marked low risk and allowed to bypass secondary inspection. There were no deep scans, no K9 units, and no containers opened. Shipments were transferred directly from vessel to truck in under 90 minutes, a speed usually reserved for urgent government cargo. Financial records later explained that silence. The bribes were modest but relentless, ranging from $15,000 to $40,000 per container, and funneled through layers of shell accounts. Over time, those payments surpassed $68 million. The impact of the network was swift and devastating nationwide, with more than a ton of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl reaching residential communities, a sharp rise in armed violent incidents across multiple states, and hundreds of children reported missing without clear explanation, all traced back to a single criminal pipeline. This was not chaos, but a carefully engineered system, deliberately hidden and sustained by illicit money. The first arrests at the port involved individuals the public trusted most, yet investigators determined the cartel's core infrastructure was still active. The operation soon shifted from analysis to action, as federal authorities prepared for a direct confrontation. At 4:58 a.m., under heavy rain along Puget Sound, FBI and Department of Homeland Security command centers launched a coordinated plan spanning the state of Washington. The objective was clear and uncompromising: dismantled the network in a single sweep before any warning could spread through encrypted channels. More than 1,200 federal and state officers were deployed across 9 counties, targeting seaports, warehouses, office buildings, residential areas, and data centers. At the Port of Seattle, tactical teams moved first, sealing access routes, halting cranes, and ordering dock supervisors out of control rooms as the operation began. Within minutes, 27 containers flagged through tracking analysis were isolated on the pier, where thermal scanners revealed abnormal heat signatures behind steel walls, dense masses where no machinery should have been. Simultaneously, armored vehicles advanced on Emerald Coast Logistics' primary warehouse south of downtown Seattle. From the outside, the building appeared dark and inactive, but inside, it was anything but. When agents breached the eastern entrance, they met resistance not in the form of gunfire, but deliberate obstruction. Steel doors reinforced from within, and server rooms locked behind biometric shields. The operation quickly became physical as hydraulic tools tore through barriers and teams advanced methodically, room by room. Investigators soon uncovered a concealed operations hub, 48 active computers running on independent power supplies, encrypted routers linked to overseas servers, and digital maps tracking container movements in real time. At 5:22 a.m., the first arrests were made, including warehouse supervisors, shipping coordinators, and financial handlers, with phones seized mid-call and servers pulled from their racks. Pressure mounted statewide as officers in Tacoma intercepted 3 long-haul trucks ready to depart, one concealing 620 kilograms of cocaine behind false insulation panels, and another carrying $4.1 million in vacuum-sealed cash designed to evade detection. In Spokane, federal teams raided a suburban office complex posing as a consulting firm and discovered detailed accounting ledgers tied to 39 shell companies, each masking a separate fictitious revenue stream. As dawn broke, helicopters circled key sites and traffic units sealed major routes, leaving the network with nowhere to move. At 7:10 a.m., Abdul Rahman Yusuf Hassan was arrested at his suburban Seattle home without resistance or statement. The residence contained no luxury items, only documents, phones, and meticulously labeled hard drives. By midday, the outcome was clear. More than 2.6 tons of narcotics, $38 million in cash, and extensive digital records were seized, exposing years of organized criminal activity. Over 140 individuals were arrested statewide, and a logistics system that had operated quietly for nearly 5 years collapsed in less than 6 hours. There were no celebrations or speeches, only sealed evidence rooms, controlled movement, and a shared understanding among agents that this was not the end of the case, but the moment the truth could no longer remain hidden. By the afternoon, the operations had shifted from loud confrontations to precise, controlled enforcement. Following the statewide strikes, federal efforts became methodical, disciplined, and relentless. Command centers transitioned from live operations to containment, ensuring the network could not regroup through hidden channels or loyal intermediaries. Inside secured facilities, FBI and Department of Homeland Security analysts began piecing together the full scope of the raids. Hard drives were imaged, phones mirrored, and server racks dismantled and transported under armed escort. Every file was logged, every timestamp cross-checked, solidifying the evidence. Across Washington state, agents confirmed 39 shell companies linked through complex ownership structures, all managed via proxies and offshore accounts, which had laundered over $520 million in 5 years' money, disguised as consulting fees, equipment leases, and freight optimization services, none of which reflected real business activity. Dispatch logs revealed the final operational map, documenting routes, dates, and codes. Every container moving through the Port of Seattle had a twin record in an encrypted system, one for customs and one for the cartel. Over 14,000 container movements were traced, many tied to narcotics, shipments, and human trafficking that had previously been lost in the noise of global trade. The human toll was then quantified. Federal Victim Services confirmed over 3,000 individuals had been trafficked through the network's corridors, some forced into labor, others into exploitation rings, with many still being located. Each recovery required time, medical care, and protection. The effort did not end with arrests. It extended into rehabilitation and justice. Over the following days, the perimeter of enforcement widened. Bank accounts were frozen across 7 jurisdictions, property seized in 4 states, and shipping licenses revoked, systematically dismantling the network's reach. Port access credentials were permanently revoked, and within 72 hours, Emerald Coast Logistics ceased to exist as a legal entity. Its branding was stripped from terminals, its trucks impounded, and its digital presence erased. What had once seemed like a legitimate mid-sized company collapsed into an evidence trail spanning continents. Federal briefings reached a clear conclusion. This was not a crime born of opportunity, but a deliberately engineered system designed to hide within American infrastructure, exploit, trust, and convert silence into profit. There were no victory speeches or public celebrations. Instead, sealed courtrooms filled with binders, grand juries convened, and indictments were drafted carrying decades-long sentences. For the agents involved, the final phase of the operation carried a heavier weight. They knew that dismantling the network did not erase the harm it had caused. Communities would spend years absorbing the aftermath. Families would search for answers, and courts would move slowly. Yet, one fact was undeniable. The pipeline had been severed, the machinery stopped, and the silence that once shielded the network was gone. For the first time in years, the Port of Seattle could move freight without hiding a covert war beneath its decks. After the cranes stopped and the containers were sealed, one question lingered. How did this happen? How could a criminal logistics network move over 14,000 containers, launder more than $520 million, and traffic thousands of people through one of America's most critical ports without being stopped? The answer was unsettling. The truth wasn't hidden beneath the system, it was protected above it. As federal teams reviewed internal records, a disturbing pattern emerged. Over 5 years, 37 formal warning reports regarding Emerald Coast Logistics reminder notices, compliance flags, anomaly alerts had been filed, and every single one was downgraded. Some were closed within hours, others rerouted to departments without authority to act. Several were quietly edited, dates changed, risk language softened, signatures replaced. This was not negligence, it was coordination. Investigators traced a small circle of intermediaries operating in plain sight. Port legal advisors, trade compliance consultants, and private security contractors hired to protect critical infrastructure. None of them handled drugs or moved people. Their value lay in controlling which questions could be asked. Emails recovered from seized servers revealed the shield in action. Requests for secondary scans were labeled operationally disruptive. Repeated night arrivals flagged by junior analysts were dismissed as statistically insignificant, and customs officers who refused clearance were transferred within weeks. The cost of silence was precise. Financial investigators traced over $92 million flowing into political action committees, maritime security grants, and consulting retainers funneled through shell foundations and advisory firms tied to port oversight and transportation policy. On paper, the payments appeared legal consulting fees, risk assessments, infrastructure reviews, but in exchange, Emerald Coast containers were classified as low-risk freight. Once labeled, they moved freely. No deep scans, no K9 units, no manual inspections. An internal memo spelled it out plainly. Do not disrupt priority commercial partners during peak throughput hours. Peak throughput hours, coincidentally, were between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the exact window the cartel exploited, night after night. What shocked investigators most was not the money, it was the mindset. These were not criminals lurking in the shadows. They were professionals in offices, wearing suits, attending meetings, and speaking the language of efficiency and growth. They told themselves they were protecting jobs, trade, and stability. But stability for whom? By shielding the pipeline, they allowed over a ton of lethal narcotics to flood American neighborhoods and enabled hundreds of children to vanish into forced labor and exploitation. Human lives were traded for uninterrupted commerce. Federal command reached a grim conclusion. This network did not survive because no one saw it. It survived because too many people benefited from not seeing it. There were no arrests announced that day. No press conferences, only sealed indictments, frozen accounts, and names quietly added to expanding grand jury lists. Dismantling the machinery was only the first step. The real battle would be fought not in warehouses or ports, but in boardrooms, courtrooms, and the corridors of power that had kept the truth buried for years. When the containers were counted and the money frozen, some believed the story was over. They were wrong. For federal investigators, the most difficult phase began after the arrests. when the numbers stopped being statistics and became human lives. Behind the spreadsheets and shipping logs was a second ledger, written in absence, silence, and names that no longer appeared anywhere. As analysts cross-referenced port records with immigration data and missing person reports, a devastating picture emerged. Over a 5-year period, more than 3,000 individuals had been trafficked through corridors linked to Emerald Coast logistics. Many entered the system undocumented, others disappeared after arrival, and a significant portion were never officially recorded at all. Among them were children. Federal Victim Services confirmed at least 520 missing minors connected to container routes labeled low risk, with ages ranging from 7 to 17. Some arrived with relatives who disappeared days later. Others were recorded as dependents on falsified labor documents and then quietly removed from payroll systems. Once inside the network, these children effectively ceased to exist on paper. Investigators uncovered the system's methods. Human cargo was never transported alone, but concealed within legitimate shipments, refrigerated units, insulated cargo, palletized goods. The same precision used to move narcotics applied to people. Transfers occurred at night. Vehicles never stopped twice at the same location, and each handoff erased another trail. Survivors described conditions that left even seasoned agents shaken. Locked compartments, airless spaces, journeys lasting days without light. Some were transferred between warehouses as many as 4 times in a single week, deliberately disoriented to prevent identification of locations. Medical care was minimal, food rationed, and communication forbidden. This was not random cruelty. It was a system built for control. The impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Public health officials in 6 states recorded sharp increases in overdose deaths during the same period, with an estimated 18% directly linked to narcotics traced back to the port pipeline. Emergency rooms reported thousands of non-fatal overdoses, and families lost sons, daughters, and spouses without ever knowing the source. Law enforcement databases revealed another consequence. Violent crime surged along distribution corridors, with over 750 armed incidents tied to turf disputes fueled by the sudden influx of drugs. Communities that had once felt stable changed almost overnight. And then there were the survivors. As federal task forces dismantled safe houses and recovered victims, many were found suffering from untreated injuries, chronic malnutrition, and severe psychological trauma. Some had been forced into labor, others into exploitation. Many were too frightened to speak, conditioned by years of threats and isolation. Rehabilitation was not immediate, and justice was far from simple. Each recovered victim required housing, medical care, legal protection, and years of ongoing support. Courts moved slowly, families waited, and some never received answers at all. For investigators, the realization was sobering. This was not collateral damage, it was the purpose. The logistics network was not merely transporting goods, it was feeding demand, sustaining addiction, exploiting vulnerability, and converting human suffering into predictable profit. The same efficiency that kept containers moving kept victims invisible. One senior agent summarized it quietly during a briefing. Every clean manifest hid something dirty, and every successful shipment meant someone paid the price. By the time the full human toll was calculated, there was no triumph left in the room, only responsibility. Responsibility to document every life affected, responsibility to ensure the victims were not forgotten once the headlines faded, and responsibility to make sure the system that allowed this to happen could never rebuild itself in silence again. The arrests had stopped the machinery, but the wounds it left behind would take generations to heal. As investigators prepared to present their findings to grand juries, one truth weighed heavily on everyone involved. If this could happen here, inside a trusted American port, then vigilance was no longer optional. It was the cost of protecting the innocent. When the raids ended and evidence rooms were sealed, a dangerous illusion suggested the battle had been won, but it had not. What followed was not silence, but reckoning. Within days, federal grand juries convened behind closed doors, and prosecutors presented evidence measured not in pages, but in tons, terabytes, and years. The charges extended far beyond narcotics, encompassing human trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and international conspiracy. Sentencing projections were severe, with several defendants facing minimum terms of 25 years to life. and financial penalties exceeding $1.1 billion in combined asset forfeiture and restitution. More than 240 bank accounts were frozen across 7 jurisdictions, including some tied to institutions that had never previously appeared in criminal court. Yet, the case did not end with Emerald Coast Logistics. As prosecutors broadened the investigation, a troubling question emerged. How many more systems like this were still operating? Audits were launched at 14 major U.S. ports, and early findings revealed alarming similarities: identical inspection shortcuts, repeated use of the same consulting firms, and low-risk classifications routinely granted during overnight hours. The uncovering of systemic corruption signaled that the problem was not isolated, and vigilance would remain essential to prevent history from repeating itself. In 3 ports, investigators discovered active investigations that had inexplicably stalled for years. This was no longer a single case. It was a pattern for the public. The most painful impact was not legal, but emotional. Trust had been broken. The port system, once seen as neutral infrastructure, was now recognized as vulnerable. Families asked how drugs could reach their neighborhoods so easily, and parents wondered how children could disappear without alarms being triggered. The answer was difficult to accept. Systems built for efficiency can be exploited by those who understand them better than anyone else. Reforms followed, but gradually. New inspection mandates were issued, randomized container scanning increased by 43%, and overnight clearance authority was restricted. Private security contracts were scrutinized line by line, and hundreds of port access credentials were permanently revoked. Yet federal officials were careful not to declare victory, knowing that dismantling a network does not erase the damage it caused. Communities struggling with addiction continued to bury loved ones. Survivors of trafficking required years of care, and courts proceeded deliberately, aware that haste could compromise accountability. Justice, unlike commerce, could not be rushed. Within federal agencies, the case became a reference point, a warning etched into training manuals and internal briefings. The investigation proved that organized crime no longer relied solely on secrecy. It relied on legitimacy, paperwork, and silence disguised as procedure. One prosecutor summed it up during closing remarks to a grand jury. When crime learns to speak the language of compliance, the law must learn to listen more closely. For investigators who had spent years piecing together fragments of this network, the final realization was sobering. Stopping the pipeline was not the end. It was the beginning of vigilance. The true danger had never been the drugs or the money alone. It was the willingness to look the other way, the small compromises, the delayed questions, the assumption that someone else would act. That belief had cost thousands of lives. As the final indictments were unsealed and sentences prepared, there was no applause or celebration, only resolve. Resolve to rebuild trust, strengthen oversight, and remember the cost of silence. The Port of Seattle resumed operations under new scrutiny. Ships docked, cranes moved, commerce continued, but beneath the steel and schedules, something fundamental had changed. The machinery that once hid a covert war had been exposed. And with that exposure came a responsibility not just for agencies, but for the nation itself. When crime wears a suit, signs contracts, and hides behind policy, the greatest defense is not force, it is vigilance, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths before another generation is buried in silence. This story did not begin with sirens, nor did it end with applause. It began quietly in shipping schedules, inspection logs, and legal paperwork that looked ordinary to the public eye. It ended the same way, not with celebration, but with sober understanding. What was uncovered at the Port of Seattle was more than a criminal network. It was a warning. The greatest threats do not always announce themselves with violence. Sometimes they arrive in suits, speaking the language of efficiency, hiding behind procedures meant to protect progress. For years, the system survived because it appeared legitimate, because it blended into daily life, and because silence was easier than scrutiny. That silence cost lives. It cost children their futures, communities their safety, and families answers they may never fully receive. Justice in this case will move slowly. Courts will deliberate, sentences will be handed down over time, and healing will take longer than any investigation. But one truth is undeniable: the machinery has been stopped and the pipeline severed. What happens next depends not only on federal agencies or courtrooms, but on vigilance, the refusal to look away when something feels wrong, the courage to ask difficult questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. History shows that systems fail not because evil is powerful, but because good people grow accustomed to silence. This case broke that silence. And if there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this. The price of freedom is not only enforcement, it is attention.